Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Hometown Heroes. I'm Mike Kenichi, and I am delighted tonight because we have four gentlemen here who, if anybody knows about Valley football and the history of Valley football, these four men do. We're joined, first of all, by former Seymour coach Paul Sponheimer, former Derby coach Charlie DeCenzo, former Ansonia and current assistant coach Bobby Lisi, and former Shelton head coach and current assistant Tony Branca. And guys, I want to thank you for coming on today. This is going to be awesome, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
So, Paul, I'll start with you because I think Seymour didn't really originate as far as football went till about, 1946, somewhere along those
Yeah,
lines?
46, 47, somewhere in there with Mr. Janenda. Coach Janenda started us off. And went from Janenda to Gessick
Right.
to Heffernan to Sponheimer to
Right.
Lennon to...
So, I mean, you kind of were, right involved as a young kid. You were probably maybe, 8 years old by the time, Coach, your father-in-law, as a matter of fact, took over the program. Would you say around that time?
Somewhere around there. I lived by French Park back then. We were playing at French Park, and I'm not sure how old I was when I became the water boy.
Right.
But I do remember the games, with Shelton under the lights. The lights were pulled up on a
Right.
40-foot ladder, and then Derby would come the next week. That's back when we played games. You sort of could set your lifestyle accordingly. But, yeah.
So say as like a 9-year-old kid, did it take a while for Seymour football to get popular because it wasn't in existence that long? I mean, did it take a little time, would you say?
It seemed like it was something that people wanted to do because people were there at French Park. Whether they were watching the game or not, they were there. It didn't have the history of the other Valley schools,
Right.
which go statewide, nationally. But we tried, and we tried to catch on as quick as possible.
Right. Now, Charlie, I believe when you were probably maybe 12 years old, you had, was Coach Palmucci there yet, or was it still?
Coach Palmucci was there, yes. That's the first coach that I remember, Coach Palmucci.
Right. Now, what was it like for you just going to games as a young kid? Were you into it at that time, or did it take a little time?
No, Derby played a lot of their games in the morning, so you were up there. Most of the time we were in the end zone playing tag football ourselves and whatever,
Right.
And it was kind of a family gathering place, like Paul is saying at French, some people were there to watch the game, some people were there to do other things, but it was a drawing point, no question about it.
Right. Now, Coach Lisi, I believe when you were a kid, Coach Jarvis was still there, correct? He hadn't quite stepped down yet.
No, he was still there. He was the head coach, and what really I remember is walking to Nolan Field from the other side of town,
Yeah.
and watching Jimmy Delavolpe and Jack Hunt play.
Right.
And and then having later on coaching with those guys. It's really I remember that vividly, watching them play, and the one of the great Derby game down there where we had a big offensive line at that
Yes.
point. I mean Jack
Hunt,
Jack and Ennis and Malone.
Right.
And I tell you what, they were big, and there was a goal line stand in Derby. We didn't get in, we got beat, and I remember that. It was down in Derby, right?
Yes,
Charlie?
it was. I remember Pop Shortell throwing the markers on the field when you get the first down.
That's right. I remember that. So it does go back a long way for
Right.
us.
Now, Coach Palmucci was only there a few years. Coach Gazik wasn't there quite yet, but Boots was probably the one who had the most notoriety back then. Were you in all of Coach Jarvis, even as a young kid?
I was a freshman playing on the freshman team, and he was the head coach for that 1 year. And then Ronnie Carbone came that 1 year after, when I was a sophomore. But Coach Jarvis, he was revered. He used to. Of course, when you were a freshman too, there were certain things you had to do, and you had to stay out of the way.
Right.
And that's what we did as freshmen. And we were downstairs in the locker room. And
Right. Now, Tony, I believe, was it Coach Sherwin that was still there at the time when you were a young kid? Shelton back then, too, was a very good football program. I believe 1960 they were undefeated. I could be wrong. But just talk about what it was like as a young kid going to see Shelton play, especially if it was against a Valley team.
Well, my exposure to Shelton football really didn't start until I was in 8th grade. Even though I had
Right.
been here from young elementary, living up in Huntington, and I don't like to use the word Huntington because people up there, they think that they're an upper crust of Shelton,
Right.
but they're really not. Where we lived up in Huntington, I was far out in the corner of Trumbull, Monroe, and my first exposure to any kind of football, because I was way too heavy to play any type of youth football.
Right.
In 8th grade, I had gotten a letter from the head coach at the high school waiting for me to come and play at Shelton High School. So when I did get to Shelton High School, and I love the fact that I was able to have the exposure and playing at Lafayette Field.
Right.
To me, that was the epitome of Shelton football, to be able to practice on that field, go into the locker room. Although as freshmen, we had to play in the dungeon of the field house. It was really,
Right.
when they talk about blood and guts and dirt and mud, we were in it. But I really got a sense of what the history of Shelton football was like right away, right as a
Right.
freshman, being able to start my time at Lafayette Field. It was something I really enjoyed.
Right. Now, Charlie, were there any type of players you saw as a young kid that you really were like, wow, I love watching him play? Was there any player that stood out, any athlete that stood out when you were a young kid?
Well, I remember a couple, valley-wide too. I mean, Derby certainly, Wayne Kruger,
Right.
great lineman that they had, and Frankie Ishman was probably the first high school star that I remember,
Right.
going up and watching him play. But I remember like Shelton Court, Barry Conway,
Conway.
Barry Conway, So there were so many big name people in the Valley, and again, you did get to see them because at that time we were all playing each other,
Right.
So it was rather important.
Right. And Bobby, you talked about, Jack Hunt, Jimmy Delavolpe. I mean, I think sometimes people forget what a great player Jack was because he was such a great coach. But I mean, he was a man when he was like 13. I mean, the way he played. Just talk about Jack and Jimmy a little bit, watching them play.
Well, Dell was an athlete.
Right.
I mean, he was a three sport star, and he was a real fine basketball player. And of course, Dell would tell you any of those things too. He would tell you.
Right.
He was this great athlete. No, he was though.
Absolutely.
And but Jack was just, again, at that time, I mean, he was big.
Right.
And then he went to Wichita State. I mean, he had coaches. Jimmy Johnson was one of his coaches.
Right.
And we used to talk about stories like that. He had a real fine coaching staff at Wichita State, but I just remember again going back and watching them play. So it was really special for me then to coach with them.
Right. And Paul, was there anybody that stood out when you were like
I
a
think-
young kid?
First name that jumped out at me was Jimmy Terradine.
Right.
And maybe because I heard he was a running back, he touched the ball a lot. Then there was Joe Pollock. Those were, when I was running the water out there, those were the first guys I wanted to give the water to. But there were also, linemen that were outstanding, but at the time, I didn't know they were outstanding.
Right.
But like Skippy Pollock,
Right.
Joe's, he was outstanding. So just learned the names from the loudspeaker mostly, not having the idea that, wow, they're good because I know what I'm talking about.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, there was no Pop Warner yet, correct?
No.
So, I mean, these kids basically learned how to play football the
Freshmen,
day they were freshmen. So, I mean, it's amazing. Like, you really credit the coaches because, I mean, these were some of the best players you'd see in high school football.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even growing up as a kid, we had a team, again, living by French Park. We called it the Parkside Rams.
Right.
And we would travel to Ansonia, play against Dennis Phipps, had a team over on his street. And on a Sunday afternoon, our parents would take us. We were in mishmash uniforms, but you played
Right.
before Pop Warner.
Now, did you guys all were you confident that you were going to come out freshman year to play? I mean, because, sometimes you're a young kid like that, you do get a little intimidated, you're not sure if it's for you. All four of you from the start wanted to play? Or
7th grade in Seymour, because
Yeah.
we had a junior high. so it was 7th, 8th, and 9th. And you
Right.
pretty much, yeah.
My group of guys in Derby, we were a little shortchanged because at the time we were on split sessions,
Right.
and we actually didn't. When I was a freshman, we didn't have a freshman football team.
Right.
We went to school at 12 noon and got out at 5 or something
It's
at night.
crazy. Yeah.
It was, and my first formal football practice came as a spring of my freshman year.
Really?
Walked down the field, with
Wow.
the seniors and everything else. Never having, I mean,
Played
how do we put the stuff on?
Right.
And there we were, and that's how. And that was the first year Mr. Carbone was there. Coach Carbone was there.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Bobby, I think was it 1968 was your first year, or 67?
No, well, that was in high school, but in 1965, Ansonia had the first Pop Warner program.
First Pop Warner
And,
program. Yeah.
I happened to be the quarterback at that point, but we were coached by Bobby Kayaski, a great All-American,
Yeah.
Roger Goodson,
Yeah.
Jack Ahern, Marty Lawler. I mean, we had some outstanding coaches, and I was in 8th grade.
Right.
So then you just went right, you went right to high school. I mean, on that team was Tommy Condon, Carl Larova,
Yeah.
and we had a lot of good players on that team. But the closest when we went to New Jersey, we went to New York, and
Right.
it was fun. So, but that was my first, initiation into football, and just carried right on over to freshman year.
Right. Now, Tony, you had the mindset you were going to play freshman year no matter what?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, who was somebody you kind of looked up to when maybe you were in 8th grade and said, I want to play because of this guy or because I saw
Well,
this
in
guy
8th grade,
play?
I did start to watch a little bit of the high school football games, and I don't know if the other coaches here remember, but Shelton was huge. Back in 67, 68, had guys like Mike Fabosi at 6'6", 260,
Right.
and Froelich and Havanek and Nora Gemma and Russ McKinnon at tight end and Don Sheehy at quarterback. I was just in awe of the size of those people. And when I finally came out for football my freshman year, because of my size, John Doherty was the head coach in Shelton at the time. And I guess because of my size, he liked using me as the guy for his boys to go against.
Right.
I was someone of size, someone that Froelich and Fabosi and all those boys had something they had to work to block. Little did I know it gave me a lot of lumps in my head.
Right.
But it was something for me to look up to because those guys were they were linemen. Obviously, I can go by listening to a lot of the other coaches. We always seem to refer to a lineman.
Right.
And being linemen ourselves, some of us, I just looked at those guys and just knew that someday I would be there.
Right.
And fortunately enough, health-wise, that I was able, without getting hurt,
Right.
be able to get out on the field and play.
Right. Now, Charlie, when you were a sophomore, obviously it was your first year, as you said, but you also get Coach Carbone. So, I mean, you're learning football if you're going to learn from anybody, not a bad guy to have to kind of learn the game. And you had some tremendous seniors on that team. I think you had Bobby Ahern, Jimmy Robinson, Al Mangillo.
Right.
You had Mike Lombardi, who was like a junior. So
Right.
it was a nice education, the football, your first year.
It absolutely was. And ironically, we had Coach McAllister.
Right,
Was
yeah.
the assistant.
Coach Scuba.
Matter of fact, he's our line coach. So I worked with Coach McAllister when I first started. That was a very interesting year, to say the least, kind of traumatic in a lot of different ways because I think because of the system Coach Carbone came in with and his different personality and whatever, we lost a good number of good players too that,
Right.
that left the team.
Yeah, I think
that was
7 seniors quit.
Yeah, that was
correct?
a very
Yeah.
difficult
Yeah.
year. But on the one hand, on the other hand, it allowed a young kid who had not played football before as a sophomore basically to get in and start playing.
Right.
So we kind of turned the season around at the end of the year. We won our last 4 games, which was nice. At least we, got things going in the right direction. I think that was the beginning of building, the Derby program back to respectability at that time.
Right. You have any good Carbone stories? Any that
gosh.
stand out?
There were a lot of them. Well, first of all, he's a great coach and a great technician. I mean,
Right.
Ryan was just outstanding. But one of the things we always talk about, is we used to, back in the day, have triple sessions when you first started and all that stuff, And one day we had a Sunday off, and it was Labor Day weekend. We were going to have practice Labor Day morning, and he had gone to the Yale practice in the meantime, or on Sunday. So he came back. We started our drills, and after every drill, he put in a little jaunt up to the scoreboard, tagged the scoreboard, come back, and by the time he came back, the next drill was ready.
Oh,
so
geez.
he caught this from Yale. We weren't too happy about that, you know. But no, playing for Coach Carbone, Coach McAllister, I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, they were just great coaches, and they're tough. They were.
Right.
And they were tough people, and they knew what they wanted, and they worked us hard. But they taught us some great football skills and some great life skills. They really did.
Right. Now, Paul, I think you played for both your father-in-law, and then your senior year was Coach Heffern's first year, correct?
My father-in-law my sophomore year.
Yeah.
Heff was down at the middle school. Then he came up my junior year. So my
Yeah.
junior and senior year, I played for Coach Heff. But I started out my sophomore year with Coach Gessick, who later became my father-in-law. And very fortunate. 2 different personalities.
Right.
And I hope I took a little from both of them as I moved on as a person. But I would say Coach Gessick was much more personable in regards to the way he handled things. But Coach Heff, Dan, was, you talk about a technician, fundamental, student of the game. I remember back, he had a problem with an official about how far off the ball we were.
Right.
Next Monday, he goes in and he's got the home ec teacher showing the center's number from the top of his shoulder pads to the butt of his cheeks, so that we could even get farther off.
I remember that.
But those were the things, but he read the rule book before that. As long as your helmet was breaking
Touch
the
the
butt of
lineman
the
numbers.
lineman's number. And he just did things like that. And he loved to throw the ball.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was ahead of his time,
He
from what I
was.
always
Yeah.
heard.
Yeah.
He was an offensive
He was kind of the Eric
genius.
Coryell of
Yeah.
of the
Yeah,
time.
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but no, it was good having both of them as coach. But I always say, you were talking about players. Dan coached me, Joe Gessick coached me, but there was a senior named Eddie Shea who
Yes.
taught me how to play football. And I used that in my coaching career later to my seniors, that before you leave here, you got to teach somebody.
Right.
I can tell you
He was
where to line
All-State,
up.
if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Oh, yeah. Eddie Shea was a dominant player and went on to Cornell. Yeah. But he taught me football. And I always hoped that during my career that some of my upperclassmen would teach the youngers before they left.
Right. And Paul, you kind of were fortunate. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they might have been in their sophomore year, but you had 2 guys on that team, and Mark Allen and Dennis Rosen, who may have been the best quarterback wide receiver combination, definitely in Seymour, but maybe in the state. Talk about them a little bit.
They were exceptional, Dennis had hands that the only other person I ever saw was Frankie Romano, who had hands, but Frankie was a lineman. Dennis had these huge hands, ran precise patterns. And Mark, he was being groomed from the time he moved from Cleveland, Ohio, to center school, playing dodgeball with Heff as the gym teacher.
Yeah.
Heff already knew who the quarterback was going to be by 67, and they were exceptional athletes, not just football players, and still remain close friends. Mark's in Chicago, and Dennis is right in Seymour, but speak to Mark probably once a week. But he was precise, and he was a tough kid.
Right.
A lot of times people think quarterbacks, well, they got to come on. He was our middle linebacker on goal line defense. I mean, he was a ball player. He loved to compete.
Right. And Bobby, I think you were a sophomore when Coach Carbone was there, correct?
I was a sophomore, and then Coach McAllister came my junior and senior year, and we had a rough go.
Right.
You know, we weren't successful. We were 2-7, and you know, Coach Sponheimer, John Sponheimer,
Right.
aptly named those the Lisi years. You know, we were 2-7 both years, and he never lets me forget it. And,
Yeah.
You know, so anyway, it was a tough go, but just like Derby, when Coach Mack came when I was a junior, we lost half a
Yes.
dozen
Yeah.
real fine football players.
And I believe the quarterback you lost as well.
No,
correct?
John Knapp was there.
John Knapp was there. Okay.
You know, he stayed, but we lost some real fine players. You know, there was a change. You know, Coach
Yeah.
Mack, you know, he was an ex-Marine, and
Yeah.
you know, there was one way to do things, and that's the way we learned how to play and coach.
Right. And now, Tony, you would end up playing for, correct me if I'm wrong, was it Sherwin or was it Coach
George Martin.
George Martin? Just talk about George Martin a little bit, because he was a tremendous coach as well. You know, Derby had that big run in the 70s, so sometimes it gets a little overshadowed, but Martin was as good as any coach in the game.
It took him a while. I mean, when I played for John Doherty the first 3 years, and he was an old school, just a tough son of a bee. I mean, he
Yeah.
was. When Paul talked about playing for two different types of coaches, I played for the old blood and guts guy my first 3 years, and George Martin came in, and I think that was the beginning of, I don't want to call it modern football, but he just, first of all, he was a player's coach.
Yeah.
You know, he cared about kids. Matter of fact, I was a selected captain at the end of the junior year at our banquet, and he wanted me to play, but he knew that I couldn't play at the weight I was at.
Right.
So he had said to me that when I come back for fall ball, that I needed to lose about 50 pounds.
No
Otherwise, he
pressure.
wasn't going to let me on the field.
Yeah.
So, oh no, I'm sorry, that was John Doherty. But Martin knew what John Doherty had said, but I didn't think that Coach Martin was going to hold up to what Doherty had told me to do. So fall starts, and here I come back at 260 pounds and not worried because Coach Doherty's gone.
Yeah.
And Coach Martin turns around to me and said, "I thought you were supposed to lose weight." I said, "Well, I was supposed to, but he's gone now. I didn't think I had to do that."
Yeah.
He said, "Well, it doesn't matter if you're captain or not." He says, "You're at the back of the line." He says, "And for every 5 pounds you lose, you can move up a line in Cal's."
Right.
And thank God I was able to lead Cal's my first game. I had lost like 45 pounds in 3 weeks, put the rubber suit on, sweat, 90 degree. You guys remember all of the hot days and the triple sessions. And Coach Martin, still to this day, he's somebody that I can go up to, and we just love seeing each other.
Right.
We love seeing each other. I think he resides down in Florida now, but every once in a while he does come back up, and we meet up at Highland, and we'll just talk about the old days. And he's probably someone that I emulated as far as being a head coach.
Right.
He's somebody who worked hard at the game. He wasn't that figure, from what I hear from these guys. Coach Carbone was probably not a very approachable coach. He was probably more of a tough guy than anything else. But Coach Martin was somebody who you could go to, talk to, if you had a problem, even other than football. He
Right.
was the type of guy that, although he knew the game, because after I had left and graduated at Shelton, he was starting to turn the program around and became successful in 73, 74.
Right.
He did a nice job.
Right. Now let's talk about some of the rivals in the Valley. I want to start with Shelton and Ansonia, because unfortunately, this is why I was never a fan of the SCC, because we saw that rivalry come to an end. But in '94, that rivalry ended. But that's one of the rivalries that sometimes goes under the radar because of Derby and Ansonia, Derby Shelton. But that was a tremendous rivalry, that Ansonia Shelton rivalry. And in a lot of ways, it really kicked off the first Valley game, because it was always the second game of the year.
Mm-hmm.
So Bobby and Tony, just talk about that Shelton Ansonia
I
rivalry.
tell you, I mean, just going back to when I was a junior, or a senior, you know, they had Tommy Krugel, Frankie Cooper,
Yep.
and we played under the lights. And Paul talked about, you know, the lights. They brought in these portable light poles, and we
Yeah.
played Shelton under the lights. It was a great crowd, but that was a real intense rivalry. And obviously, when Jack became the head coach, when he came back after that
Yeah.
in '87. We don't talk about the '86 year, but in '87 we're playing Shelton, and they were real good. They were an outstanding
Yeah,
football team.
and that was a
James
great
Lane,
game. Yeah.
James is our quarterback, and
Yeah.
we go for two at the end of the game. We score, and
That was the
We're-
8-7 game, correct?
it was
Yeah.
'87. We're in the wishbone. I remember the play. We just motioned the back out of the backfield, ran an out pattern, like a crossing pattern with them, and we go for two and get it.
Right.
Because we were not gonna, we weren't gonna.
Because I think it was going to end in a tie, right?
It would have ended in
right.
a tie because they didn't discuss it before
Right.
the game, which is what you had to do back then.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but that was a huge rivalries, and we always used to. We would go down to Charlie and Leon's, and Leon Sylvester was there, and we loved just to break them off on Leon about
Right.
the great games, and we luckily we were able to have at the end a real nice winning streak against Shelton, but they were outstanding.
Right.
Yes, I remember that team in
It's
'87.
funny. It's funny you mentioned that play. I still can visualize looking at the film. We had Coach Steve Kalovich that when he does go in motion and come across the field, that you go with him.
Yeah.
And in the film, you could see that he's just with his eyes locked up in the backfield. The Ansonia kid goes in motion right past him. He doesn't go with him, and they get to two.
Right.
I remember that game like it was yesterday. But all Valley games,
Yeah.
regardless of who was playing who, I think that was the highlight of the season. The
Right.
Lyman Halls and the Sheehan's and East Havens, and although East Haven was always a tough
Yes,
game back in the
when we
day.
first started, East Haven, North
Right.
Haven.
But I'm
yeah.
sure that every coach here, whenever we had to play each other as a Valley game, the Valley game was talked about.
Right.
And a lot of people in town talked about it also.
Right. And would you say your practices were more intense when you knew you were playing a Valley rivalry? Yeah.
More intense, longer.
Just a little.
Just a little bit.
I mean, I know Frank Allu was intense for Ansonia Week. I know that. But, I mean, in a lot of ways, not that it's ever easy to play an opponent, but in a lot of ways, when you're beating each other up like you guys are, playing somebody like, a Lyman Hall or playing somebody like a Torrington or whoever it may be, sometimes it felt like a night off. Am I correct? Or because you guys brought out the best in each other.
I think the intensity level was totally different. And when I'll never forget Bobby and I one time. We had played each other, of course, and then we got into the playoffs. We're going to play each other again. We got to do this again. Another week like this. It's just so intense, and you're trying to make sure every T is crossed and every I is dotted, and just the intensity of the kids and the practices and the whole thing. And the atmosphere was just totally different, totally.
Right. And the other thing is too, if you were having a bad season, sometimes a win over a big Valley rivalry could kind of save your season. You talked about the 62 team. They were 0-5.
Absolutely.
They played Ansonia, their rival. You beat Ansonia. I mean, I know Billy Pucci. He beat Ansonia senior year. That was one of 2 wins, but he's never forgotten about it.
Yeah.
And sometimes beating those rivalries can save a season.
Oh,
I could
absolutely.
think of, 1991, for example. Derby was 2-0. You guys were 0-2. And they were on a winning streak. They had just come off a state championship, and you guys pulled off the upset at Ryan Field. So, I mean, it looked like your season might, downward spiral, and that saved it in a lot of ways.
Over the years, probably the Derby game for us, because some parents who had played at Derby
Yes, moved up to see.
moved up to Seymour, and God bless them, Steve Tracy for one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a brand new Derby shirt. I don't know how many shirts they lost on it, but there was a brand new Derby shirt for the tackling sled all week.
Yeah.
It was always out there. And not only that, we're playing Derby or we're playing Shelton. There's more fans there during practice
Right.
week. We could be there by ourselves for any other game. They wouldn't know who we were playing. But that week, and I'm going to say it, and I know you're going to lead into it, but the Sentinel,
Yeah.
God bless, just let us all, the fans, the coaches, the players,
And the Tinty's
if they
cartoon.
never read anything else, the players read the Sentinel
Yep.
to find out who do we have to look out for
Yeah.
coming,
And it was huge. And, a Seymour Derby game, obviously I wasn't alive for it, but I've always heard about the 69 game. And you talked about how you left practice early in the morning at Milford Academy, and then you got to the game and it was a mob there.
Ah,
and those 2 teams may have been the 2 best teams in the state that year. I mean, It was
Yeah.
18-0 at the half, Seymour.
yeah.
Then Derby went on a run in the second half.
Oh, yeah.
Tremendous game, though, and I think you were a coach on
I
that.
was. I was a freshman coach
Right.
at the time. It was, you're a little stunned at halftime, 18-0.
And correct me if I'm wrong, and I really believe this too, and we'll touch base on it in part 2. But I really believe you don't necessarily have to hate your rival, but you have to have somewhat of a dislike, or else it's not really a rival. And I know that Lou and Coach Heffron had a little rivalry with each other, and I think they brought out the best in each other because the way those two coached that game, from everything I've heard, was just intense.
I mean, Dick Downey was the coach at Milford, and he says, we're practicing on Saturday, and we had a lot of, Zuba was from, Nick Cerny was
Right.
from
Yeah.
Derby. We had a lot of Valley kids that were there, and he says, you want to go to the Seymour Derby game? We got to practice. Now, the kid from Brantford didn't really want to be there at that hour in the morning because of the Derby Seymour game, but got there. I mean, luckily, I was able to wheel my way onto the field to
Right.
watch it. But I mean, there were people
Oh.
8, 9 rows deep. It
Yeah.
was, the hill. Who was standing on the hill by the
Right.
time we got there?
Had to be a great time, though, to be a part of something like that, living in the towns you lived in and just seeing that stuff, especially Thanksgiving, the way Thanksgiving was packed,
I'll tell you, Mike, one of the fondest memories I have was always the first week of the season. We would play in the morning, and Sonia would play at 1, and I think it was Shelton and Seymour would
4
play
o'clock?
at 4.
Yeah.
4.
Yeah.
And you
Yep.
would go, it was like a happening. You would go to those games, and I swear to God, you saw the same people
People.
at every game. But it was
Yeah.
outrageous. It was such a great weekend, though,
Yeah.
such a great Saturday.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, Tony, talk a little bit about Derby Shelton, because another rivalry, it's definitely Shelton's biggest game of the year, and Derby views it as a big game. But, Derby has Ansonia, so Ansonia is always going to, obviously go first when it comes to their rival. But just talk about Thanksgiving, Derby Shelton. Now, I want to ask you this, and you don't have to answer me this, but I just want to ask you this. There's always, my good friend Jimmy Lewis, to this day, said it was sunny. It was 1986. It was a sunny day in the morning at Finn Stadium, and when he got there, the field was mud. Did Coach Riggio?
We won't go there.
But just tell me. I mean, you don't even have to tell me. But is it possible the sprinklers were running that night? And if it was, I think it's great strategy by
if they-
Coach
If they were
Riggio.
put on, I didn't see them on, and I
Yeah.
know it wasn't something that Coach Riggio
Would
had
do,
asked anyone
right.
to do. If it did happen, it might have happened via assistant coaches or friends of assistant
Right.
coaches or something like
Yeah.
that. I mean, personally, I
Maybe
didn't
Supa
know.
was doing
I
it.
wasn't aware of anything that was going to happen like that the night before.
Right, but
I
just
was surprised as anybody.
talk about that game, because there were so many good games. I could think of 85 Derby. Was 9-1 going into that game. You guys, I believe, were 6-4. It was a down year for Shelton, and you pulled off an upset in overtime. It was on a Saturday morning. That was a great game. I think about the 87 Shelton team. They had given up, 28 points the whole year, and Greg Patnella went nuts that day.
Yeah,
Derby
he did.
won 33-8. Just talk about how it didn't matter what the record was. It's a Valley team, and you better be ready to play. Talk about some of the Derby Shelton games.
It was as intense as any high school game could ever be.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these guys here remember the 10, 12,000 people
Yeah.
coming to a game. Talk about 5 and 6 people deep. As a team, I mean, and as a coach with his team and prepping the kids up, like we were talking about before, you're playing another Valley team, you step it up a bit. I think it's the people within the town that made it as big as it was. And personally, I married a girl from Derby, so there's a
Yeah.
lot of family going back and forth. Derby had the Sparrows,
Yes.
Shelton had the
Yeah.
downtown guys, and it just festered into both towns, with that game being the pinnacle of what anybody would do that day.
Right.
And to wake up on a Thanksgiving morning, and back then I don't think they had the breakfast. I'm not sure. I know I went to a breakfast once. We had a kid on our team, Ritter.
Yeah.
was from Derby.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
Jamie.
he was on
Ray.
our team,
Yeah.
and he happened to host the breakfast. So there I was on Thanksgiving morning, going to a Derby house to have the breakfast before we went to the game. You know, I always call the Shelton Derby game a Civil War.
Right.
I
It's a civil
remember one year, Tony. I don't know. I can't remember what year it was, but I don't sleep well to begin with. But a night before a game, forget it. I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. There's about 7 inches of snow on the ground. I called Tony. Frank, what are we gonna do? Why? What's the matter? I said, Tony, did you look out your window yet? No. You better look out your window. Don't you? Oh, geez.
I do remember that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that kind of drove you nuts a little bit because you're practicing like crazy
Oh,
for that
I-
game.
I
Now,
always-
that's the other thing
always
I wanted,
hated postponements.
I wanted to ask
Oh,
as
yeah.
far as Thanksgiving goes, and you both could answer it as well. Did you find it sometimes hard to prepare it right because it was on a Thursday as opposed to a Friday or Saturday? Because John D tells me the story that your mindset would always get a little goofed up during Thanksgiving.
I was always uncomfortable with it. I mean, Coach Lou used to say, well, you know, it was Monday afternoon, but he said, well, today's Wednesday, you know, scheduling your practice and all that stuff. But
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, I was never comfortable. Should we give the kids a few days off? Should we not? You know, to me,
Right.
it was a little bit. This wasn't quite
Well,
right.
you were
right.
on schedule.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, as a football
Yeah.
coach, and you don't
Wasn't
throughout
quite
the
right.
year.
You know, you just
And you
had
guys
that extra
didn't have
time.
Thanksgiving back then, so you kind of just played, you know, on
Yeah.
Saturday against Amity. So
Right, Amity
you know,
was our last
You were
one,
able to
yeah.
prepare okay.
Yeah.
Did you sometimes wish you had a Thanksgiving game back then?
Always went to a Thanksgiving
Yeah,
game.
yeah.
You know, absolutely. I remember when we first started with Woodland.
Yeah.
You know, my wife says, "Well, you're not playing on Thanksgiving," so she's the one that really put it on a Wednesday night, not me. But you know, I definitely wanted it a
Right.
game, and it became a.
When Ridge was in Shelton, we actually talked. He and I talked about let's put this thing on Wednesday night. You know, that didn't go anywhere. The traditionalists wanted it on Thanksgiving Day.
That's one thing in Ansonia and Naugatuck, we will not play other than Thanksgiving morning. Right? You know, we're fortunate. We have been getting great crowds, and we've had some real memorable games. But
And that was
something-
Jack's favorite
There's
holiday.
something special about
There is.
Thanksgiving
Right.
morning. You know,
There
you
is.
wake up and you know, really is something that I love it. I love it.
And I'm
to
glad
this
you.
day.
I'm glad you brought that up because although he's not here with us today, you know, during this segment, one guy that should never get unnoticed is Coach Peters. He was a tremendous coach at Naugatuck, and what a job he did. And he made Naugatuck, you know, part of the valley in a lot of ways because he played Seymour, he played Ansonia, and he always kind of played those games, you know, to win them. And
Our barometer was Seymour Naugatuck. And I know Paul and Craig Peters they had some battles over the years, boy, I tell you that.
Yeah.
But that was really how we kind of gauged, listen, how good is Naugatuck?
yeah,
I mean, Naugatuck for us was our longest running rivalry.
Yeah.
Right.
Forever. They seem to always be having a great season, you know, and so for us, as Bobby was saying, it was a big gauge. Where do we fit in against that league? We're representing the Houstonic League
Right.
at that time. I mean, now we're an NVL team, but back then, for us, the NVL meant non-violent league. Okay, and Craig found out about that, and there were a few games where he beat the hell out of us. I mean, and I had a mother that, and Craig, I love you dearly, but named him the pig because of the scores.
Yeah.
And she made a ceramic pig that we put in the end zone,
yeah.
whether we were playing up there or here, and on it we would put in every year that we had beaten them. All right. One
Yeah.
year, I mean, during halftime, pig was still in the end zone. Greg's going off. Boom! He drops kicks that thing into 1,000 pieces. But you talk about a great coach. I mean, you know, everybody on 3rd and 12 was always worried about the pass. I said, linebackers, watch the draw. Watch the draw. You know, but a great coach. And
Great person.
when we went to the NVL, and Woodland came in, and they were going to be our Thanksgiving Day game. I remember it distinctly that the ADs asked, you can pick 3 teams you want to play. And I said, well, Woodland's obviously going to
Right.
be one of them. I said, Naugatuck's our longest rivalry. We want to play them.
Right.
And I said in Ansonia, one of the other NVL coaches goes, "Why do you want to play Ansonia?" I said, "Well, we touch borders, if you haven't noticed." I said, "They're the best in this league." And I
Right.
said,
Right.
"If you're going to play, let's play the best." And, you know, and that luckily has been at least a game that they have continued because Naugatuck dropped off for some reason.
Right.
But anyways.
Well, guys, it's hard to believe part one's, we already finished it, but part two is going to be even better because now you're going to tell what it was like to coach against each other. So thank you for coming on part one and looking forward to part two. For Hometown Heroes, I'm Mike Kenichi saying good night, everyone.